Hello everyone, my name is Dagoba and welcome back to Satisfactory. Today we're going to be taking a look at the alternate recipes that are available to us in the early game. We're going to go through each recipe, talk about when and where they might be useful, and create a tier list so that we can prioritize which ones we want to get first and then which ones we should save for later or avoid picking up altogether. Now there are two methods for unlocking alternate recipes. The first and simplest is to enable advanced game options, which gives you the cheat menu, and there's a checkbox in there which automatically unlocks them all by default. This is definitely something to do on later playthroughs, as the process of gathering all the hard drives can get pretty tedious. There are over 100 in all. But on your first playthrough, I think it's worth going through and exploring, finding them all by hand. That's what we're going to be doing here today. Now, in order to use these hard drives to unlock alternate recipes, our first step is going to be to send off the field research milestone in Tier 1. Let's get into it. Alright, and with that milestone away, let's create our tier list while we gather some hard drives. We're particularly looking for 4 hard drives before we get into any more research, because there are some really excellent recipes that are available right from the start, but the pool of recipes is going to expand as we unlock additional technology. By researching 4 hard drives before we unlock any research in the MAM or unlock part assembly at the hub, we can guarantee that we're going to get them all. There are 6 recipes that are unlocked right at the beginning of the game. First up, we have iron wire. This is an S tier recipe all around. It allows you to use iron to create wire, which allows copper to be used for more rare and valuable components, and it greatly simplifies the half dozen or so factories which use both wire or cabling alongside iron or steel products. This is a solid S tier recipe and we'll use it throughout the game. Our other S tier recipe in the early game is cast screws. This simplifies screw production and thus most of the early game factories, while also being more efficient than the default. This recipe is absolutely worth taking straight away. Next up, we have a C tier recipe that can become an A tier recipe if it's paired with iron wire, and that is the stitched iron plate. This is a simpler and more efficient recipe than the default reinforced iron plate recipe, but comes with the downside that it uses copper as an input material to create wire. With iron wire, this remains an iron-only recipe and becomes a staple that we'll be using throughout the game. Next up, we have a B tier recipe in the bolted iron plates. This recipe really shines later in the game, and at mid-game, I might even classify it as an A tier. It's massively more efficient than the default recipe and it uses similar components, but it requires Mark III belts to fully supply, and with Mark I miners that probably aren't overclocked anyways, you're going to have a hard time supplying it early on. Even with all that, it's still better than the default recipe, so it's worth picking up, but its full potential won't come until later. Finally, we have 2 F tier recipes, and that's the iron and copper alloy ingots. These are completely useless in the early game as they require a tier 3 building, the foundry, to even use in the first place. Even once you use them, they provide only a modest improvement to resource availability, and they don't last very long because they become obsolete once you unlock the pure ingot recipes in Tier 5. We're going to pass on these if they come up. Our hard drives are just better used somewhere else. Now, those are the only 6 recipes that you can even get from hard drives in the very early game, but once we unlock the part assembly milestone in Tier 2, we'll be able to get 2 more. First, we have the bolted frame. This is a B tier recipe, especially in the early game. It's more efficient than the default recipe and it uses similar components, so it's an upgrade in that regard, but it requires Mark III belts to fully supply. It's worth picking up, but it's not worth seeking out. Next, we have the copper rotor alternate recipe, which I put firmly in the D tier. This makes rotors way faster than the default recipe, but it uses copper as an input material to provide copper sheeting, which makes the recipe much more complex and trades a common resource, iron, for a rarer one, copper. Until you have the resources and logistics of the late game, this one is more trouble than it's worth, and even in the late game, it's a hard sell because copper becomes more valuable later on. Finally, doing a bit of research in the MAM unlocks 5 more recipes for us. Now 3 of these I classify as F tier recipes for the early game. That's Caterium wire, fused wire, and fine concrete. These all have some late game application because they give you more output for less input, but they use rare resources to make common components, and they're hard to justify in the late game and they're less than useless early on. In the B tier, we have fused quickwire. This is similar to the others, but the resource trade is copper for Caterium, which is a lot easier to go along with. It's still not excellent in the early game, but it's not completely terrible either. So it's worth using or picking up if you either start with all the alternates unlocked in the advanced game settings menu, or if you have an excess of hard drives, especially since a number of recipes already have you using copper and Caterium in the same factory, which will allow you to use this recipe very easily. Lastly, we have cheap silica, which I also put in the B tier. This is the same story as fused quickwire. It turns limestone into silica, so a very common resource into a rarer resource. But it does complicate the factory and it uses more power. Alright, we are back from our exploration trip, and you can see that we have picked up all of the resources that we were looking for. We found some Caterium, some power slugs, some sulfur, and some quartz, as well as some mycelium and 4 hard drives. And 4 is the magic number of hard drives in the early game. So we're going to crack those 4 hard drives open, make sure we get all the alternate recipes we're looking for, and then we'll dive into the rest of the research. All right, our first hard drive is complete, so we're going to go ahead and take our cast screw recipe. That is one of the most valuable recipes in the game, so we'll pick that up and start on our second hard drive. Our second hard drive is all complete, and it looks like we got our iron wire recipe, so let's go ahead and grab that and start on our third. Our third hard drive is complete, and we did not get our stitched iron plate recipe, so we'll go ahead and take the bolted iron plate recipe because that's the best recipe available to us, and we will go ahead and start on our fourth hard drive. And that is our final hard drive complete. Let's go ahead and grab that stitched iron plate recipe. All right, now in addition to the hard drives, there are a number of other research trees that are in the MAM, and by gathering all those resources on our expedition, we've been able to unlock most of them and at least see the early technologies in each tree. We'll likely do a deeper dive into these at a later time, but it's worth digging into these trees early on as they provide very useful things like the ability to overclock or expand your inventory, or mobility aids that help you get around the map a lot easier. So it's definitely worth taking a look at research in the MAM. Lastly, the final thing I wanted to show off today is that I got a couple of lizard doggos here. Now these are doggos that I just picked up out in the world. When you see a lizard doggo out in the wilderness, all you need to do is place a paleberry on the ground in front of you. The doggos will run over and eat one, and at that point they are your friend. They'll follow you around, and you can put them in an enclosure like this. It's important to keep a slab of foundation underneath them, or they will eventually despawn, but these will be here forever. And now if we open them up, you'll see that they have an inventory that they can occasionally bring us goodies in. Now, for the most part, what they'll bring us is helpful, but there is the possibility that they'll bring us some nuclear waste, and that's what these storage containers are for. This is a automated belt system that allows us to quickly deposit hazardous waste right here, and that will automatically be belted away before it becomes properly dangerous to us. And as we explore, we may find more lizard doggos and place them in this or other pens so that we can gather some resources. Lizard doggos are actually a renewable source of power slugs. There's several hundred on the map to begin with, but there are an infinite number available from our friends here. So we're going to keep our friends here, and every time we log into the game, we'll see if they have anything for us and just use that as an additional resource. And I think that's going to do it for today. I'd like to thank you for spending a few minutes with me today. I hope I've made your day just a little bit better. Leave a like if you've enjoyed this video and subscribe if you'd like to see more. I'm also looking for additional games to play, so if you have ideas for what sort of content you'd like to see, feel free to leave a comment down below. I make sure to read all of them, and I try to respond to most of them, and I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you have an efficient day. I'll see you soon.